Welcome to the Building Web3 podcast. Today we're joined by Ethan from the Particle Network. Learn how Particle Network simplifies Web3 with social logins and account abstraction across 900 applications, eliminating complex bridging and providing seamless user experiences. Remember, nothing stated here is financial advice. Welcome to the Building Web3 podcast. Today, my good friend Ethan. He is the head of developer relations at Particle Network. Ethan, before we get too deep into Particle Network, let's talk a little bit about your background. What brought you into Web3? What was your come to crypto moment?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've been in Web3 now for, I guess, 3.5 years, 4 years. I originally got into Web3 when I was 15. That's when I started building in the space. So kind of was originally attracted by some of the initial Dogecoin bull runs and wanted to see if I could invest and start mining Dogecoin and get in on all the action that was happening, and realized pretty quickly that investing wasn't my strong suit. I'm not very good at making those calls. So I transitioned over into building things because I was kind of inspired by a few applications that I saw, and felt like it would be fun to just try to build on-chain applications and things that interact with the blockchain. Just the kind of concept of blockchain overall was very exciting to me. And so I built a few applications when I was 15, and some of them did pretty well. Got some good adoption. I think I had one that was kind of like a bot on Discord that let you do transactions on chain, and that got a few thousand users. It was pretty popular within the Harmony One community, which is an old blockchain. They aren't around too much today, but back then they're pretty popular. And from there, whenever I was 16, I transitioned over into kind of my first full-time role in the space, which was a developer relations manager at a large RPC provider called Chainstack. And I did that for around 1.5 years. I ended up leading developer relations over there about a year in, and then I joined Particle Network back in September of last year. So I've been at Particle for close to a year now. But yeah, long journey so far.
Yeah, and you're definitely not the only person to come from the Dogecoin setup. I think we've had a few guests come in via that way. Now, talk to us a little bit about what is Particle Network? What are you doing there?
Yeah, for sure. So the kind of TLDR of Particle is that we build a lot of solutions that basically are geared around like solving foundational user experience issues. So things that have been plaguing users and kind of been a foundational part of why Web3 has been kind of difficult to onboard into for a long time. And so evolutionarily, like we started about 2.5 years ago, I think at this point, we started building with social logins. So this is like our core product for quite a while. So basically infrastructure that allows users to create wallets and use applications using things like their Google account or their Twitter account or email and phone number and stuff like that. And so that was our main infrastructure for like 1 year plus. And it actually got a lot of adoption because it solved a pretty foundational and core UX issue, which is that downloading a wallet, saving a seed phrase, all this stuff is a somewhat daunting task for users. And it's hard to ask brand new users, especially consumers, to do this. And so it's far easier to give them basically a sign up with Google button. They choose a Google account, now they have a wallet, and that's of course much more Web2 like, and that got a lot of early adoption as a result. It resulted after all of that kind of pushing of that product for 1.5 years plus. Today we have around 900 larger products that use us, and a few million daily users, and so it's actually been really successful, and it powers a lot of very large products, especially games and social fi and stuff like that. Tends to adopt it particularly well. From that point, we still do this product, but we've kind of evolved that into what we call kind of the account abstracted evolution of it. So if you're familiar with account abstraction, particularly ERC 437 account abstraction, what we did is we basically took the same model and went from onboarding users through social logins into EOAs, which is kind of like the standard account model. That's what you use whenever you create a MetaMask, whenever you're kind of doing any normal wallet operation, you're using an EOA. Now, EOAs are limiting because they're rigid. You can't like programmatically customize an EOA. They're bound by a private key. You can't really, there's no social recovery. You can't pay for users' gas fees. EOAs as a standard account model are not a great user experience. And so what we did was we transitioned from that into onboarding users through social logins into smart accounts. So these are basically smart contract wallets, smart contracts on chain that users use as their main account that they can actually do transactions from. So this improves the flexibility pretty significantly because all of a sudden now I can use a smart contract, which is inherently programmable, as my means of interacting with the ecosystem. And so this means that I can, for example, as a developer, pay for the user's gas fees. The user can do social recovery. So they can, for example, recover their their wallet if they ever lose access to it using like their friends and family and stuff like this. You can remove pop-ups and all these other great UX benefits. And so that was sort of the second step in our evolution, where we went from purely social logins into social logins plus account abstraction, and we also gained a lot of great traction there. We ended up with I think at this point over 10 million user operations, which are kind of transactions within the account abstraction format. And then recently, earlier this year, probably around 7 or 8 months ago, we transitioned into this larger, more popular concept of chain abstraction, which is sort of the evolution of these base technologies, particularly things like social logins, account abstraction, etc. Chain abstraction is sort of a addressal of what I would consider to be one of the largest remaining UX issues in the space. So without kind of like, talking on for too long here, basically the context here is that using technologies like social logins and like account abstraction, it's easy to actually create a pretty good user experience in the confines of a given application. So as a developer with one isolated application, I can create a good user experience. I can onboard users through their Google account into an account abstraction wallet, and this makes a lot of flexibility for me. It can feel very Web2 like. You can actually remove a lot of the Web3 complexities from the experience. That's already possible today. The larger issue with Web3 at the moment on UX level is that as a user, if I want to, for example, let's say I onboard into an application on Base, right? And I deposit 10 USDC on Base, and then I want to go use an application on Arbitrum, and I want to buy an NFT worth 10 USDC. Well, I have 10 USDC, but it's on Base, and so now I'm on Arbitrum, so I can't use that. So now I have to go find a bridge. As a user, I go do the bridge. It costs some fee. It takes a decent amount of time. Sometimes it's a little bit risky. Now I finally have my funds on Arbitrum, and I can do the transaction, and then I'm fine. But the fact that every blockchain that you use is its own isolated state, there's significant fragmentation at the user level between applications that you use on distinct blockchains, that the user experience at an ecosystem level is pretty terrible today. And so chain abstraction is basically the addressal of that issue. It's saying users should essentially be able to go to any application across any chain and use their balance without needing to bridge or manage multiple wallets or go to each chain and like manage their balance for each chain. They should just be able to use crypto and use Web3. This is the basis of the idea of chain abstraction. It's just users use applications. It doesn't matter where they have balances. It doesn't matter if their balances are on Base, Solana, Cosmos, chains, Bitcoin, wherever. They just use what they have on chain for transactions, and all the complexity associated with that is removed from the end user. This is where the abstraction terms comes in. Because to do this, there's complexity involved, but we're removing that. We're creating infrastructure that basically allows users to simply have one account and one balance they can use anywhere. And so this is what we have through a product called Universal Accounts, which is basically the evolution of all our aforementioned technologies that will create this experience of basically being able to onboard to an application using social login, MetaMask, whatever wallet that you want. Now you're in a universal account. It's a smart contract wallet. It's using account abstraction, and your balances are unified everywhere. So I can have USDC on Solana, on Base, on Arbitrum, and I just have one USDC balance that's uniform everywhere. So kind of a long-winded explanation of basically the history and kind of where we're at today and the evolution of these UX technologies.
I think this is very interesting. We touched on a lot of terms. So people are relatively new. Let's just quickly define what is account abstraction, because people might be like, what? We got to many abstractions in this definition.
Yeah, for sure. So to kind of, I guess, take a few steps back towards account abstraction. So account abstraction was a pretty big UX unlock in the space. I think it first started proliferating a few years back, especially with some of the initial proposals by Vitalik and related researchers. And so essentially, account abstraction at its most simple form is especially it's most applicable to the Ethereum ecosystem, because the Ethereum ecosystem has the issue of, like I mentioned, that users use an account structure called EOAs, or this stands for externally owned accounts. So externally owned accounts are very simple structures. They're simply bound by a public key. This is what you deposit funds into, and a private key. This is what secures and is basically the authentication key for your account. And so that's it. These are not capable of storing or processing any specific code, or they're not programmable. They are purely used for transferring in and transferring out of assets and generating signatures, basically authenticating the ownership of a given account. And so these accounts, as a result, for consumers, are not very good interfaces, because as a consumer, my needs are really complex, and they can't be met by a structure as simple as just here's one key that authenticates my entire wallet. This wallet can only do these basically 2 or 3 functionalities, and that's it. that's not enough for user needs and is really limiting to what developers can use, and actually creates a lot of issues for users because like the most relatable problem for EOAs that most people can understand very quickly is the existence of a seed phrase. And so as a user, whenever I go and create a MetaMask account, for example, this is an EOA or an externally owned account, it has a seed phrase, which is just a representation of a private key. And the seed phrase and the fact that you just have to manually secure this is one of the biggest reasons for theft and loss of crypto today, because we're expecting consumers and users who are non-technical. These are people that just want to use applications in the space. They don't want to worry about these things, but we expect them to basically like securely manage what is like a few words that access and contain control for all of their on-chain assets. So you can imagine if your bank account had like 12 words that if anybody found it out, they could drain all your funds and there's nothing you can do about it. That's a pretty terrible experience. Like there needs to be some solution for this. So the same issue is present in crypto today, where it's like just using externally owned accounts for consumers is not practical at all from a security level, from a flexibility level. And so the solution to this, the answer to this problem is account abstraction. And so this is the transition from externally owned accounts into using smart contracts, so programmable on-chain contracts, as actual interfaces for user accounts. And so as a user, I basically use these contracts to then send transactions, manage my funds, do anything that I want. And as a result, because these contracts are intrinsically programmable, I can do a lot of things with this. I can, for example, first of all, like there is no central seed phrase here. So security and stuff like this is very different. It looks differently. So you can do security through things like passphrases or on-chain hardware security and stuff like this. You can create a wallet using your Face ID or your fingerprint. I can secure a wallet using different key shares saved between family members or friends. I can do transactions that don't have gas fees. I can have multiple different addresses that simultaneously can like authenticate my wallet. I can limit what my wallet can do. I can say my wallet can only spend $10 on Monday, and I can unlock $50 on Friday, and then maybe over the weekend I can spend a little bit more. All of these rules and conditions that were impossible with externally owned accounts are now applicable to users' accounts through the means of account abstraction. So it basically takes what is a rigid, non-programmable model and allows you to apply any condition, anything that you can imagine, basically, to the actual account basis to improve security. So it makes security far more accessible in Web2, like for users. Like, for example, if you're familiar with Coinbase Smart Wallet, this is one of the more popular implementations of smart accounts today, where I can go and create a wallet using my Face ID. That's it. Now I'm done. And I have my wallet. There's no seed phrase attached. I don't have to manage anything out. I don't have to write down some words and go throw it into my fire safe. I just use my wallet. And so this is a very foundational improvement. But overall, account abstraction, smart contract wallets in particular, they allow for this flexibility that basically turns Web3 into the potential of actually having true consumer adoption. Because without it, accounts are just too low level. They're too primitive for end users, especially at the consumer level.
And then the seed phrase question, because I know people that if they're not familiar with account abstraction will be like, but how do you recover that account? How do you what happens? Because this is such like a fundamental paradigm in crypto. Like I got my MetaMask account, I have the seed phrase. So how does that work in terms of like recoverability? Because you mentioned social recoverability in the past.
Yeah. So it depends on the actual account. Basically, what you can understand is that smart contract wallets are not basically the same type of account mechanism as EOAs. So there is no single key that will purely authenticate a smart contract wallet. Basically, the way that smart contract wallets work is that they're signed by an underlying externally owned account. So an externally owned account, like your MetaMask account, for example, is the authentication that can then do transactions for a smart contract wallet. And this is variable. So for example, I can have 3 or 4 wallets that authenticate the smart contract account, which means that there is no single point of failure typically for these smart accounts. And so there's a few different ways of basically securing access to the smart account or recovering the account. You can transfer ownership from, for example, I can say this smart account, I no longer want this to be on my MetaMask. I want it to now be on my Rabby wallet or something. And so I can transfer ownership of that into a different external account, different set of keys. Or I can, for example, use like a secure enclave or things that can basically kind of like manage authentication and keys for the account for me. This is like kind of where the Face ID example comes in. And so you aren't bound to having to manage and pull and move a private key. Now, a lot of Web3 infrastructure today has been set up, for example, exporting your private key and throwing it into a different wallet and stuff like this. But I would even argue that like the fact that we have users do this, and if I want to move a wallet, I have to go and take my private key, which is such a core part of my wallet that if I do anything incorrectly with, or if I have a compromised machine, what could be my livelihood or my bank or like what I store my assets in, that could be gone if I have one tiny mistake. We expect users to do this to just simply migrate across wallets. Account abstraction offers a far more simple alternative that doesn't carry the same risk through things like transferring ownership of the account, or similar kind of things that don't require me to take my single access token and move it from one place to another and trust that that place I'm moving it into is not logging it somewhere and then storing it. So this is basically where at a security level, account abstraction most often is far more secure than externally owned accounts, because simply you're moving a lot of the burden of security from the end user to more complex mechanisms, like I mentioned, like kind of like, usually it depends on the wallet, but things like Face ID and other more sophisticated ways of securing an account and managing authentication. So this is for users a net benefit when it comes to security, for sure.
Absolutely, and thank you for the very in-depth background on account abstraction. Now let's go into chain abstraction, because this is another issue that people are quite familiar with. You're like, okay, I want to use this thing on Arbitrum, but now I need to get funds to Base. But you'd also mentioned like even across the EVM ecosystems, like, hey, going on Solana. So let's talk a little bit about chain abstraction and how like fundamentally that would work.
Yeah, definitely. It's I always love talking about this, and I talk about it a lot between these events and stuff like that, because I truly do believe that like the ecosystem today, like I mentioned, it's great that we can create good UX, but the ecosystem is so fragmented that there's kind of two big issues that pop up here. The first issue is that at a user experience level, like I mentioned earlier, I have to cognitively manage my balances across X number of chains that I'm using. So if I'm using Solana, Base, Ethereum, Bitcoin, some Cosmos chains, if I'm using 20 blockchains, that's 20 balances that I have to manage. Not even to mention that I have to use different wallets between some of these chains. So on Solana, maybe I'm using Phantom. On EVM, I'm using MetaMask. I'm using Kepler for Cosmos. And so not only am I managing different balances for each chain, I'm managing different wallets and different extensions. Like this is just like it's unimaginable that we'll actually get consumers to buy into this and be comfortable like learning all these different things. The only reason why it's acceptable today is because most people in the space that tolerate it, they do it because they're enthusiasts or they have some incentive to do so. And so basically what chain abstraction will do at an experience level will allow users in like actual implementation to, in most cases, have one wallet that they want to use. If they want to use MetaMask everywhere, they can do that. If they want to use Kepler everywhere, if that's their preferred wallet, then they can do that. If they want to use Unisat everywhere, like the Bitcoin wallet, then they can do that. And importantly, users lose the notion of distinct chains. So as a user, I actually, in most cases, won't know the blockchain that I'm using or the chain that a given application is hosted on. So if I go to a DeFi application, and let's say this DeFi application is on Arbitrum, and I start earning some yield, or I do a swap or something, and then I go to a different application on Solana, the experience is the exact same for me. I have the same balances, the same wallet interface, same identity. There's no distinction here between the experiences on both. We're removing this information. We're abstracting the multi-chain complexity from end users, the processes that are required to do that. They don't need a bridge. They don't need to know what chains they're using. They don't need to manage different wallets. So as a result, users are what I call agnostified from distinct blockchains. They simply use applications, because today users have a relationship with basically two entities in a given scenario in Web3. Users have a relationship with the application that they're using, and users have a relationship with the blockchain that application is built on, which is kind of ridiculous, because it's like, imagine if I went and used YouTube, right? And it was on Google Cloud, and I wanted to go and use Riverside, which is what the application that we're using today. And it was on AWS, and all of a sudden I have to do all these things, and I have to think about, okay, this is on AWS. I have to go use a different browser maybe, or a different device, because that's on AWS and YouTube's on GCP. It's like, this makes no sense actually. Like, hold on, like this is not user friendly. So basically, chain abstraction takes this experience as users. All they need to worry about is the application that they're using and the total amount of funds that they have, where these funds are, where the applications are. This is infrastructure. And to users, it should be positioned as infrastructure. Anything more is too complex. And so to users, it becomes basically the same as the cloud provider that the application that we're using on Web 2. It's the same thing to us as it is to Web3 users with chain abstraction. So blockchains turn into like the AWS of the Uniswap app that you're using. I don't care like what chain that it's using. I just want to use the application. And so this is the next evolutionary step for the ecosystem that will allow users to really use apps in a Web3 native fashion. And another kind of interesting part of this that I think will shift Web3 pretty significantly is the fact that today, because of the environment where chains are so segmented and isolated, as a developer or as a marketer or just like somebody that's working in the space, incentives are actually not necessarily aligned with true innovation. Because, for example, blockchains, they spend millions on marketing to end users. They do airdrops, they do marketing campaigns, and they're marketing to users. It's like the same thing. Imagine if AWS is trying to market to me as a user to go use applications on AWS. It's like, this doesn't make any sense. And so all of a sudden with chain abstraction, when users are removed from the notion of specific chains, public blockchains are no longer going to need to market to users because marketing to users doesn't make any sense now because they don't know what chain that they're using. And so as a result, they focus on attracting developers because ultimately what these public blockchains want is they want activity, they want users, they want transactions, they want gas revenue, stuff like this. And so now in a chain abstracted world where users don't know what chain that they're on necessarily by default, blockchains, they focus more on being a better environment for developers. And so now developers, they have more access to more resources. They have more access to better blockchains, to better architecture, because incentives are aligned in a way where they make the most revenue if they capture the most developer attention. And then for developers, this is an even more important component of this, which is that as an application developer, if I'm building, for example, a DEX on Linea, right? My competition is only other applications or other DEXs on Linea. My competition is not an application on BNB because the users between BNB and Linea are totally different. And my addressable market is just those on Linea. And so all of a sudden with chain abstraction, like I said, where all users are agnostified, they're removed from the confines of these chains. My competition is now applications on BNB. My competition is the entire ecosystem. And for developers, this creates a totally different environment because I'm not just going to chain A and chain B and deploying the same application and hoping that I capture some users. It's much more a competitive free market now where the incentives are aligned in a way where applications really now need to optimize for the best user experience, for the most secure applications, for things that are truly innovative, because it's much more competitive. I can't just create a Uniswap fork and deploy it because like who's going to use that if users can go in any application? I have to create something that users actually want to use, which is, I don't know if you're at ECC, but one of the big takeaways was we want less infra and more apps. I totally agree with this. But I think that the incentives are just not there for that because as a developer, it's easy to just make a fork of something and go deploy it on 10 different chains, get some grants, get some users. But that's not possible in this type of environment because competition is fiercer and developers need to make things that are actually innovative and actually capture real user mindshare. And so all that said, this experience has two effects. Users can use anything from any blockchain. They don't need to know where their balances are. They don't need to know how to get between chains. They just use applications. And incentives are aligned in a way where everybody is basically better positioned to create applications and experiences that really benefit users and are exciting for consumers. And so the reason why I'm so excited about chain abstraction, why it's been talked about a lot within the ecosystem recently, is because of just these implications that it will have in the ecosystem and how it'll shift the day-to-day experience of Web3 and position it far better for actual real consumer adoption.
I got to say, I'm already excited to re-listen to this episode. So I always used to say, if we want to get more people into crypto, like my mom's not going to go to a website and be like, oh, wow, they use MongoDB. Like she's going to be absolutely agnostic as to whatever database this website uses. And this is essentially where we need to get to in crypto land. So this is great to talk about that. So let's talk a little bit about, now we understand, chain abstraction, account abstraction. Let's talk a little bit about particle network and, how you guys are approaching simplifying this like UX experience across chains and across accounts.
Yeah, for sure. So basically the way that we fit into this whole image, like I won't say we're the single arbiters of like this entire experience. We fit into a very narrow part of basically what will enable this type of feature. So we're specifically building what we call account level chain abstraction. So basically giving users the ability to use accounts that are agnostic. Chain abstraction is applicable in a lot of different areas. For developers, there's chain abstraction tooling. For protocols, there's chain abstraction tooling. For accounts, there's chain abstraction tooling. And so going back to what I mentioned earlier with the evolution from account abstraction to chain abstraction, we basically use account abstraction as a basis to give users accounts that they can, for example, create using MetaMask or Unisat or social logins or whatever they want. And these accounts can have balances anywhere. And they are basically unified in a way where they can use them across the entire ecosystem. So all we do is basically give users an account that they can use with any wallet, with any social login, whatever it may be. And that account contains the ability to use balances from the entire ecosystem in a way that's uniform and doesn't require bridging. So that's the part of the stack that we fit in. It's called universal accounts. That's the type of product that we're building. For developers, they basically integrate it as an SDK within their application. The developers support it. The users, I go to the application, I connect to my MetaMask wallet. I have my universal account. I have my balances there that can be across 400 or 500 different blockchains. I use it for the application. I go to the next application that supports it. I log in. I do the transactions that I want, and I move on, and so on. And so that's essentially what we do. We basically give users the interface and the account that is required to create this type of experience. And so this is materialized through what we call universal accounts.
And then let's talk a little bit about, we'll call this the nerd corner. How do you implement something like this? Like you obviously have an SDK, but now you're interacting with a bunch of different chains. There's account abstraction details. Like what goes into building a product like this?
It's a lot. There's so many moving components. We have if you go to our blog and you look through some of our articles and you read through it, it's just like, if you aren't just like super tapped into every tiny component of this infrastructure, then it's insane. It's just like way too much. Because for abstraction, essentially what you're doing is you're looking at the user experience and you're saying, look at all this complexity, let us handle this. And handling that complexity, especially on an infrastructure level, is unsurprisingly complicated. And so the main way, like I'll kind of focus in on like probably one of the most asked about components of how this is achieved, which is simply like, how as a user do I use my balance on Base for a transaction on BNB or whatever chains you're talking about? Because that alone is pretty like, it's difficult, right? Because today you just have to go bridge. There's this complicated mechanism. So how do you enable that? The actual architecture here is it's like the underlying mechanism of this is simpler than you might expect, which is simply just that as a user, I want to buy an NFT, let's say on Base, it's 100 UCC. I have 50 UCC across two different chains. And what we're doing is we have something called a filler. We call it a liquidity provider, but you can understand it as a filler, or maybe you've heard the term solver, or similar kind of terminologies. Where basically what we do with this kind of entity is we'll say, this user wants to do a transaction for 100 USDC. We're actually going to pay for their transaction. So we're going to front the funds that are required to pay for this transaction for 100 USDC, because we know that they have 50 USDC on chain A and chain B, and they want to do this transaction worth 100 on chain C. So we know that they have the funds for it. They just don't have it on the chain that they want. So we're actually going to pay for their transaction. We're going to give them the funds required to pay for it on the chain that they want to do the transaction on. Then these fillers will pay themselves back using the funds on the chains that they're basically paying with. So if I'm paying with funds on Base and Arbitrum, and I'll do a transaction on Polygon, then this filler or the solver is saying, okay, I'll pay for your transaction, which makes it very fast. So I'll just give you the funds right now. Then I'm going to pay myself back using 50 USDC from Base and 50 USDC from Polygon, or from Arbitrum, whatever I said, the kind of the chains that you're spending from, and that's basically all. That's how it works. It's very simple. It's similar to, if you're familiar with a cross or other types of intent-based bridging. It's the same exact mechanism, at least in principle, which is just having solver or filler or whatever you want to call it, basically pay for the user's transaction, front the transaction, and pay itself back using funds and other chains. And so it's not the same thing as like canonical bridging or like bridging that you're used to, where you have to wait for all these different things to happen until you finally have your funds in the destination chain. It's basically moving the value that the user wants in the other chain, because we're not moving the tokens themselves. We're just saying, you want to spend 100 UCC, or you're going to spend, the equivalent amount in ETH or whatever it may be. You can do it. We'll pay for the transaction. We'll just pay ourselves back. So this means that, for example, I can do a transaction. I can buy an NFT on OpenSea that is denominated in ETH. I can pay for it in Bonk on Solana, because you're bridging value, not tokens. And this is really the big differentiator here, is that you're just simply paying for the user transaction, paying yourself back. So this is the easiest way to understand how the architecture of simply getting funds across chains works. And when you apply this at the account level, and you do this for every transaction, where every payment I want to do is just this exact mechanism, but repeated and multiplied across X amount of chains that I'm pulling funds from, it basically allows users to do this in a way that it takes usually less than 5 or 10 seconds to actually finalize something like this. And the fees are not much higher than what they would be normally. There are, of course, some additional fees from the added transactions and what you're doing, but it's pretty negligible compared to what you would expect from a given transaction. So that's basically how that architecture works in the backend.
And then you mentioned intents, and we've done a few episodes with people can go back to the Enzo episode, they can go back to the Manta Network episode. But could you quickly describe what an intent is and like how that fits into this architecture?
Yeah, for sure. And I'm a big fan of Enzo. These guys are awesome. I'm sure you guys did a good episode. We're pretty close to their team as well. The intent space is it's very adjacent to chain abstraction. So intents are a distinct concept. They're different from chain abstraction, but they fit very closely within the chain abstraction umbrella. They're a technology that's typically used to achieve this type of experience. And so intents are very simply just like sort of it's easiest to look at it as like as a concept, the ability as a user to basically express something that I want, whether that be I want to get funds from here to here, or I want to, buy an NFT at a certain price and sell it at a certain price, or any goal that I want to articulate or have that requires multiple different conditions and steps. Intents are basically the ability to achieve these without needing to basically go and manually do all this myself and like watch the easiest example for an intent is like limit orders, right? So I want to buy Bitcoin once it reaches $70,000. And so I wait. Let's say $75,000. I wait and I check it and I keep reloading it. And then as soon as it hits 70, I click sell, and that's a transaction on chain. Intents basically say, okay, I'm just going to basically sign and say I want to sell this at $70,000. So whenever it hits there, do it, and that's my intent. I want to sell Bitcoin at $70,000. And I want to sell this amount of Bitcoin at that price, and then it gets done. So intents are just ways of expressing your goals on chain and having them be achieved. And this is specifically done by things like solvers. And this is like the entity that basically achieves and executes an intent. So intents are very commonly used in account abstraction, especially for bridging. So intent-based bridging is sort of what we do in somewhat of a way. We don't do like full-on intents. We call it sort of like pseudo intents to some degree. But it's basically just the best mechanism of getting funds across chain. So basically every chain abstraction solution that you see out there, most of them use intents to some degree because it is a very efficient, fast, and ultimately effective way of achieving user goals, especially in the context of things like cross-chain transactions.
Absolutely. And will you guys be building your own intents, or is this something you would send to Enzo or send to another intents network?
We have like with our fillers or kind of otherwise known as like maybe a little bit more primitive solvers. We have our own kind of network of fillers, or at the moment we kind of run our own filler for our testnet. And as we expand, we'll probably run our own network for that. Although we've done a lot of research into other ways of kind of ensuring wide participation and like open liquidity and stuff like that. There's some really interesting products building for this in the space, like Nomial, and there's even some other things that make this whole process easier, like Everclear and stuff like that, of basically using solvers and using intent systems for this. So we'll most likely kind of stick with our own sort of filler network. That's the best way to explain it. But we use a number of other technologies, and we will use a number of other technologies that support this and make this particularly easy for us and efficient. So we're very much in the light of using other technologies where it makes sense and collaborating very heavily with others in the space, and especially near the chain abstraction stack. It's a big part of what we push. And so for intent specifically, there's a lot of opportunity for that. And so we definitely expect to, but for the actual network itself, we'll run it ourselves.
Absolutely. And it does feel like, Particle is helping move to this more user-centric ecosystem. You mentioned, Coinbase's smart wallets. Like, how do you see the evolution of Web3? Like, do you see like account abstraction becoming very mainstream, like kind of the de facto standard? Where do you see things going in the ecosystem?
Yeah. What I would hope is that, of course, I wish I had, some prediction machine where I would know 100%. But what I would hope is that in hopefully less than 8 months, we'll see a pretty significantly different ecosystem where chain abstraction as an ideal will start to take hold, and we'll start to see this kind of experience become standard across every application, across every ecosystem. Users will get used to this experience of basically being chain agnostic, and this will become the baseline of how you use Web3. And so I think this will happen in less than 8 months. I think that what you'll see happen a little bit later, it's kind of like a staggered thing, is everything that I mentioned regarding how the ecosystem will shift as a result of the change in incentives. So because users are going to be mostly agnostified in, let's say, eight months or a year, the ecosystem will adapt over the course of maybe the next 1 to 2 years. And so I think what we'll see as like an end state for the ecosystem, hopefully, at least what I would hope to be the true achievement of all this infrastructure work being done at the chain abstraction level, is that, first of all, users will successfully be agnostified, and they won't have to know about what chain that they're using if they don't want to. And the ecosystem will shift as a result to a point where consumer applications are not something that we need to beg for as an ecosystem. Like on Twitter, you see all the time, like, when will people make consumer applications? We need consumer applications. And why is nobody really dedicating that many resources to it? It's because the incentives aren't there. And so they will be there with chain abstraction, in my opinion. And so as we see that evolve and as we see that take place, I think we'll not only see an ecosystem with this improved user experience with chains, but hopefully we'll see an ecosystem with a lot of consumer user-facing applications that actually have real product market fit, that take Web3 to a level that people actually want to use. Another, like, maybe even Web3 will end up in a point where it's there's not much distinction between using Web3 and using Web2. In my opinion, I think this is probably where it's going to end up at, where, for example, I'll log into an application, and in most cases, I won't really have a huge distinction between, if I'm using Web2 app or I'm using Web3 app, because the UX will just be so comparable there. But I think regardless, the types of applications that are being built are going to go far more in the direction of Web2, like user-friendly, secure, innovative, unique use cases that excite people and get users in. At the same time, we're going to have this improved user experience through things like chain abstraction, many other technologies, for the record, that are also building towards this better experience that will yield in basically what is an ecosystem that achieves what we want, which is ultimately real applications that are using blockchain technology in a way that's innovative and has real consumer adoption. I think that chain abstraction will be one of the key components to get there. It won't be the only one, but I do think that in 2 to 3 years' time, we'll have gone over a lot of these hurdles that are stopping us from being there at the moment. And one of those is this multi-chain problem, which will lead and kind of have this domino effect that will create that experience I just expressed.
Absolutely. And can you tell us a little bit about some of the upcoming milestones or developments people can look forward to from Particle Network?
Yeah, for sure. Essentially, most kind of upcoming thing is that we're getting ready for mainnet in, Q3, Q4. So very quickly, just over the next few months, we're going to be launching. And so this means that universal accounts will be usable from like day one over 900 applications, or it'll be a large number of applications. Basically, everybody that's already integrated our account abstraction technology will have support for universal accounts on day one. And so once we launch mainnet in Q3, Q4, this technology will already be, you'll be able to see it, use it for yourself across a big chunk of the ecosystem, especially, like I said, games, SocialFi, things that we're already well integrated with it. And so that's kind of the most upcoming thing to look forward to, is the launch of our mainnet. We're doing a few other things, like, of course, in Token 2049, if anybody's around, most of our team members are based out in Singapore, and we're running a number of chain abstraction events out there, and there's a lot of other chain abstraction stuff happening. So very excited for that, and we're going to be very present out there. So if anybody's around for that, then definitely go to particle.network, or we have, I'm sure we'll make plenty of announcements at Particle NTWRK on Twitter about those events, but it'll be worth time. I'm sure there's going to be a million events out there, so sometimes it's hard to find what to hit. But I would go to at least one chain abstraction event in Singapore if you have the opportunity to. So I think those are going to be the two most immediate things. It's mainnet release of our product, as well as plenty of good conversations around this subject in Singapore.
Awesome. And finally, where can people learn more about you personally, Particle Network, and just get involved?
Yeah, you can go to my own Twitter at Tabasco Web3. I post a lot about chain abstraction and kind of my opinions on the space and stuff like that. You can follow us on Twitter at Particle NTWRK. Or you can go to our website, particle.network. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about chain abstraction and diving deeper, especially on a technical level, to how this works, you can go to blog.particle.network or developers.particle.network. And we have endless content that dives into all this stuff, and I'm sure could answer most of your questions. Although if you want to talk a little bit more about this, if anybody's interested in really understanding chain abstraction, then shoot me a DM on Twitter. Happy to chat. And yeah, I think this was a dope conversation. I really appreciate you having me. It was dope to be on, and yeah, I'm looking forward to the next 6 to 8 months.
Absolutely. Well, we're excited to keep in touch with Particle Network and continue to, everyone go follow Ethan on Twitter, go interact with them online, and let's keep a good eye on the roadmap. But to all the builders out there, let's get back to building the future of Web3.